There's a trial going on right now in Austin, Texas, where a woman is accused of murdering her romantic rival in a so-called love triangle. After the incident occurred, she was investigated by the police, and the next day, she apparently fled to Costa Rica on her sister's passport, where she dyed her hair and got plastic surgery, allegedly in order to make herself unrecognizable so that she couldn't be captured. Oh yeah. And then even after she was apprehended, she managed to escape jail a couple weeks ago, making it a mile down the road before the police managed to recapture her. The evidence in this case is overwhelming to begin with, but then you add on her multiple attempts to escape, and now you have evidence of guilt of conscience, which, by the way, is being properly admitted as evidence in trial, evidence of her mental state. This case is nuts. It's a story of 35-year-old Kaitlin Armstrong, a yoga teacher. At the time that all of this happened, she was in a relationship with Colin Strickland, a professional cyclist. And when I say in a relationship, I mean an on-again, off-again kind of relationship. At one point when Kaitlin and Colin were on a break from their relationship, Colin apparently dated Anna Moriah, also known as Mo Wilson, another professional cyclist. Apparently things didn't work out romantically between Colin and Mo, but they allegedly remained friends. When Colin got back together with Kaitlin, however, things started to go southward. According to the prosecution, she became obsessive, even going so far as accessing Colin's account so that she could find information on Mo, tracking Mo through the running and cycling app known as Strava, and more. And at 9:15 p.m. on May 11th, 2022, someone shot Mo twice in the head. Mo had been in Austin to compete in the 150-mile Gravel Locos bicycle race. She was staying with her friend Kaitlin Cash. The evening that she died, Mo had dinner with Colin. Afterwards, Colin dropped Mo off at Cash's apartment around 8:35 p.m. One thing to know about Cash's apartment is that she apparently had a Ring doorbell. A Ring doorbell will often notify the owner as to when the door has been locked or unlocked, and often will take video of the front door area. And according to the app, at 8:36 p.m., Mo walked through the front door. 1 minute later, Kaitlin's Jeep was recorded by surveillance video driving by the apartment and going down the alleyway. Kaitlin's Jeep's GPS was also tracked just minutes later, about 15 to 20 yards away from the stairs that led to Cash's apartment. And the Ring app apparently also recorded Mo's scream in terror as she was killed with 2 bullets. One in the middle of the forehead and one on her right temple after grazing one of her right hand fingers. According to the prosecution, Colin's phone data places him far away from Cash's apartment at the time of her death. And in fact, there are texts showing that Colin asked Kaitlin around that time to go and get food together. She never responded. Then, as the police investigated, the police brought Kaitlin in for some questions. They asked her about her relationship with Mo and also asked her why there was video surveillance that captured her Jeep at the scene of the crime at around the time that the crime had happened. And by the way, the prosecution also said that they found Mo's bicycle not far from the apartment. This is a very expensive bicycle that's around $10,000 to $13,000, one that was very important to her and important to her career. So the idea that she would just leave it laying around is pretty minimal. And when they swabbed it and tested it for DNA, they found that there was DNA on the handlebars that had a high likelihood of being a match to Kaitlin's DNA. As far as DNA tests go, this is about the highest level of certainty that you can have for DNA tests like this. Anyway, when they brought Kaitlin in for questioning, they didn't have enough evidence to arrest her, and so they had to let her go. The very next day, she sold her car, took an Uber to Austin Bergstrom Airport, flew to Houston, and then to New York. And for a few days, she stayed with her sister, who lived in the New York, New Jersey area. Then she promptly bought a ticket in her sister's name. And with that ticket in her sister's name and the passport that also belonged to her sister, she flew to Costa Rica. If she were flying under her own name, maybe you could have some kind of an argument that she just needs to travel. Maybe all of this that happened was really freaking. She just felt like she needed to get away, something along those lines. Or maybe she had always wanted to do destination plastic surgery because it's cheaper overseas or something, and the timing was just a coincidence. But international travel on someone else's passport, especially when you've just been questioned by the police over the murder of someone else that you actually knew quite well, that's just an act that is drenched in suspicion and culpability. How do you explain that other than, yeah, she was on the lam and didn't want to get caught? Anyway, around a month later, in June 2022, she was caught. As I mentioned before, she had had plastic surgery, I think rhinoplasty, but I'm not exactly sure yet as to the full extent of the work that she had done. and she had dyed her hair. And judging by the before and after photos, I can see why the prosecution is arguing that she did this so that she would be unrecognizable so that she wouldn't be caught. And this is further bolstered by the fact that even after she was in jail for over a year, just weeks ago, she was caught on video bolting out of a doctor's appointment to try to escape. She hopped a fence, got her handcuffs off, took her prison pants off to reveal a pair of yoga pants that she had been hiding underneath, and was eventually caught a mile away. This is one of those times when a person needs to seriously re-examine their goals and the choices that they're making to try to reach those goals. If freedom is what she wanted, this is not the way to get it, because all of this is surely going to bite her in the ass during this trial. Anyways, I mentioned earlier, trial just began with opening statements by both the prosecution and the defense yesterday. There were cameras in the courtroom for the opening statements yesterday, but the court is not allowing for the trial testimony to be televised. But I know that there is some interest in this trial, so I wanted to track this case and give some updates while the testimony goes on until we can live stream the closing arguments and the verdict watch. If you're interested in seeing the opening statements in full, I'm linking to yesterday's live stream in the description below. Do note that there are issues with the court volume because they apparently did not mic up this courtroom very well. Even after I tried boosting the sound through YouTube plugins, it really was very, very quiet. But otherwise, keep watching this recap and you'll get all the highlights just the same. Basically, the prosecution's opening statement was very solid. And it's not really much of a surprise given how much evidence there is in the prosecution's favor here. Prosecutor Ricky Jones did a very good job opening this case for the jury. As I just mentioned, for our viewing experience online, there were aggravating sound issues since the courtroom it's just not mic'd up for our benefit. It's just not. Jones also kept moving away from the mic, so at times he'd be audible, other times not so much. But as frustrating as all of that was for us watching online, the most important part here is whether or not the jury could hear him. And I'm sure that they absolutely could, and that they were absolutely engaged in his opening statement. He was right up in front of the jury box, telling them the story with basically no notes other than an outline that was up on a screen, and he was basically just talking from one human to another. And in a nutshell, Jones took the jury down a harrowing path describing an obsessive woman who stalked a victim for months and planned out her vicious murder. And on top of that compelling and tragic emotional story, he basically illustrated to the jury that what they're going to see over the next few days of trial is that the state is going to bury the defendant with receipts. We're talking firearm ballistics, DNA evidence, video surveillance, various apps on mobile devices and home security systems, as well as GPS car systems, placing the defendant within 20 yards of the victim within minutes of her death. Then we've got Uber receipts and airplane tickets and passport stamps. I mean, the sheer amount of data that they have just by following the defendant's tech devices is overwhelming. And I think that starting out, the prosecution gave a very compelling and illustrative framework for the jury to start organizing all of these receipts as they unfold in front of them. Now, the defense also made an opening statement, as usually is the case, not always, but usually. The defense attorney here is Jeffrey Puryear. I really don't envy his position, to be completely honest with you. Like I said, the facts are just so overwhelming in favor of the state. And sometimes as an attorney, you get handed a shitty case and you just have to make a shit sandwich with it. Hopefully he's had a number of conversations with Kaitlin as to the outcomes that are likely and unlikely based on the underlying evidence and based on what she's done to really hurt her case with her multiple escape attempts. And here, a defense attorney in this kind of a position can really only do one thing, and that is poke holes in the prosecution's case. Remember that the state is the one that has the burden of proving beyond reasonable doubt that Kaitlin is the one who murdered Mo. It's always ideal if the defense can present some kind of an alternative theory, an alternative narrative as to what really happened. But technically, in order to do the job, the defense attorney just needs to poke enough holes in the prosecution's case to create reasonable doubt for the jury. And here, Puryear basically fulfilled that minimum role with his opening statement. He didn't really provide an alternative framework or a narrative for the jury to organize evidence as it's presented, with his framework, through his lens. He basically said, yeah, after the prosecution's opening statement, you might have your mind made up, but keep in mind that it is also perfectly acceptable to conclude that you simply don't know what happened. And if that's the case, acquittal is the right answer. And one of the things that he did was he did point out that, for all of the data and the video surveillance footage and all this other stuff that exists in this case, that there is no witness and no video surveillance footage that shows Kaitlin killing Mo. And that is a point for the defense. It's not exactly an ironclad defense, but it's something. He also basically pointed to ballistics and DNA as faulty, maybe even pseudosciences, and he implied that the lead investigator on the case is an inexperienced noob, and that the interrogating police officer might be a dirty cop. These are all ripe areas for a defense attorney to attack in any case. And in a place like Austin, the jury is going to be made up of people who might be a little bit more skeptical of police in general. Although it is Texas, Austin tends to be a bit more politically left-leaning. Part of this is because over the years, Austin has become a magnet for people from other states, particularly, notably California. And so you might have people that have California ideas about the police, bringing that to this particular case. So arousing jurors' suspicions about police is something that could potentially benefit him. Whether it'll result in a win for the defense, I don't know. I don't think so, based on everything that's in this case right now. But even aside from that, all of the evidence that is data and science, this is all stuff that needs to be analyzed. And that means that there can always be human error that is in the analysis of this evidence. There are ways in which people can make mistakes when they are comparing shell casings or making DNA matches. And realistically, there's only so much certainty that these types of evidence really can give us. However, for all of his best attempts, Puryear is going to have to try to combat the fact that there are just so many types of circumstantial evidence: DNA, ballistics, GPS, cell phone data, video surveillance, and all of it points to one conclusion, and that is that the defendant murdered the victim. I respect this defense attorney for doing his damnedest best job in defense of his client. It's what we should hope for any attorney to do in representing any client, regardless of how likely it is that they'll succeed. But this hill might just be too steep to climb here, and the evidence is probably too overwhelming. And as far as opening statements go, his was messy. It seems that Travis County Courthouse, or maybe Judge Kennedy in particular, is very picky about opening statements because the prosecution was very successful in vigorously objecting to the defense attorney's opening statements multiple times. The main objection was that he was supposed to be limiting his opening statement to a basic roadmap of what the evidence would show at trial. And generally speaking, this is true. This is really what the opening statement is all about. Judges will sometimes give a bit more leeway, maybe often give a bit more leeway, especially to the defense. And that leeway would allow them to go a bit outside of those requirements in order to set up a framework for how the jury should properly approach the case. But overall, the opening statement is not supposed to be the same thing as a closing argument. You're not supposed to be making arguments from the evidence because the evidence hasn't yet been admitted. It hasn't yet been presented to the jury. And so here the judge was fairly strict, as is her right, so long as she's operating within the rules of evidence and the local rules for the jurisdiction. So all in all, I do think that this was a rough start for the defense, even with the opening statements. But honestly, how much can an opening like that harm a defendant who has already harmed her own case a million times over? Okay, so that's opening statements, which we actually got to watch live. Then we have the witnesses. And for that information, I'm using information from journalists and other people who are in the courtroom and are basically reporting on it. The first was Matthew Wilson, Mo's brother. As far as trial strategy goes, this is a fantastic witness to start with. He's a very close relative of the victim and obviously is going to really set the emotional tone here. What it does is it gives the jury a picture of who the victim was and the tragedy of the fact that her life was taken so young. And it recenters the focus of the high stakes involved in the jury's decision. While he was on the stand, Matthew testified that he and Mo spoke daily. They grew up in a small town in Vermont. She was an alpine skier in college and in recent years decided to turn to professional cycling and quickly became one of the best gravel racers. And at the time of her death, she was living in San Francisco, but was planning to move to Boulder, Colorado. Now, when it comes to a witness like this, if you're going to cross-examine them, you have to be very, very careful. Obviously, Matthew is grieving the loss of his sister, with whom he apparently was very, very close. And there's nothing in these circumstances that can possibly indicate that Mo was some kind of a bad actor or someone who was operating in some shady circumstances. So any amount of grilling of this witness can very, very quickly backfire. And honestly, sometimes with a witness like this, it's best to just not cross-examine them at all because there's just not much that you can gain from cross-examining, but there is a lot of ground that you can lose by doing it. In this case, Puryear did decide to cross-examine Matthew, but only in a very limited way. He basically just asked Matthew about Mo's relationship with Colin. He didn't ask anything about what Mo may have experienced with Kaitlin or any interactions that she had had with her or anything like that. And this to me suggests that the defense might try to pin Mo's death on Colin. Colin was the last person that Mo saw before someone arrived and shot her. The shell casings found next to Mo in Cash's apartment did match a gun owned by Kaitlin, But that gun came from an apartment that was shared by Kaitlin and Colin. Colin also had dinner with Mo that night, but then texted Kaitlin asking her if she wanted to go and get food. He seemed to be hiding the fact that he was spending time with Mo, which, according to the prosecution's theory, is because Kaitlin was basically crazy and an obsessive nut job, and Colin was just trying to have a friendship that he wanted to have and preserve that and avoid arguments with Kaitlin. But from a defense perspective, this secrecy could be indicative of somehow keeping much darker secrets. But at the same time, none of this theory came out in the defense opening statement, so maybe I'm just getting ahead of myself here. The reason why it kind of perks up for me is because the prosecution definitely was flagging in their opening statement that Colin's not a suspect here. He's a good guy. He's not someone to even be really questioning here. They looked through that. They really turned every stone as far as Colin was concerned. He was one of the first suspects that they had, and that's it. You don't need to go down that path. So maybe all of that could have been a little bit anticipatory based on what they thought the defense might say. But anyway, the next witness that the prosecution called was Kaitlin Cash. And because Kaitlin is also the name of the defendant, I'm going to refer to Kaitlin Cash as Cash by her last name. Remember that Cash is the friend that Mo was staying with that weekend. Mo was found deceased in Cash's apartment, and Cash was the one who came and found Mo deceased. From what I can tell, this testimony was just absolutely brutal, as you can imagine. She testified that when she came home, the door was already unlocked. Then when she went inside, she saw Mo's feet sticking out of the bathroom. When she realized she was unresponsive, she called 911. Then the jury got to hear the 911 call where she's frantic and asked for EMS to arrive. In the call, she describes to the dispatcher that there's blood everywhere, but that she's not bleeding and that her quote-unquote brain is leaking. The dispatcher gave her instructions on chest compressions, and you can apparently hear her grunting and trying to revive Mo, and she's on the brink of exhaustion at the point that the police arrive about 7 minutes later. On the witness stand, she understandably broke down in tears listening to this call. And according to Alex Capariello, a journalist in the courtroom, there was a collective sigh in the courtroom once the recording ended. So undoubtedly, the jury was very, very impacted by this. Anyway, after the call, the prosecution started showing photos taken of the crime scene for the investigation, and they appear to be pretty gruesome. They also asked her about Mo's bicycle, which apparently was found tossed into a small bamboo forest next to the apartment. This is going to be an important piece later on because we already know that the prosecution teased in their opening statement that we would hear that Kaitlin's DNA was essentially found on the handlebars. Anyway, before her direct examination ended, the prosecution asked her about what she knew about Mo's relationship with Colin. Cash said that she knew that they dated in October 2021, but that they were not romantic in May 2022. But the last question was about something that Mo had told Cash when they were hanging out in the fall of 2021. Mo told Cash something about a phone call that she had received, and Cash said that Mo was agitated and caught off guard about it. But as far as I can tell, there were no further details that came up in her direct examination about this. It seems the prosecution wanted to suggest that this was a mysterious phone call from Kaitlin after she found out that Mo had just dated Colin. This was followed up by another brief cross-examination, and this is basically nothing to write home about either. The defense attorney asked Cash who else knew Mo in Austin. Apparently there was some other friend named Janine. And then he asked about Mo's relationship with Colin when they kind of sort of dated briefly. This really sounds like it was a very short-lived thing, not very emotionally involved, like not really a relationship and not exactly like a friends with benefits kind of thing, but like something in between those two. And it's a good thing that this cross-examination was also left short because this is another witness that is very, very sympathetic to the jury, and a minimal cross-examination is just best so that you don't antagonize her. The jury is just gonna end up hating you for doing it. But after this cross-examination, there was a lunch recess, and after lunch, she was actually recalled to the stand. And here the prosecution asked her once again about the bicycle. This clearly is a very important piece. And what came out was the fact that the bicycle was very, very valuable, $10,000 to $13,000. So finding a toss like that is definitely suspect because Mo would have been taking much better care of this bicycle than that, given its inherent value and then also the value that it had to her bicycling career. But then the prosecution also asked her a bunch of questions about a stick of gum that she says was out of place when she found the murder scene. This seems to have some kind of importance to the prosecution that might later become evident. I wonder, I don't know, maybe this is just some kind of a red herring. I wonder if Kaitlin had some kind of like particular kind of gum that she always likes to chew and that she left it behind by accident. Or maybe the prosecution's saying that she left this behind like some kind of a calling card, like the Wet Bandits. From what it sounds like, at least the person who left this behind wasn't dumb enough to have chewed it before leaving it behind with a bunch of DNA. But we'll see, I guess. Anyway, the defense tried to shore this point up, basically pointing out to the jury that the gum could have belonged to either Cash or to Kaitlin. So maybe it's a nothing burger. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so then we've got witness number 3, and this is the first of many police officers that they heard from on day 1. Witness number 3 was Officer Martin Salinas. He was the first officer on scene and started helping Cash with administering CPR. While administering, he noticed a shell casing on the floor next to Mo. Not long after that, he later called the homicide detectives, and he spoke to Cash about getting whatever information that he could from her. Cash noted that Mo's bicycle was missing, and the police found it 10 to 20 feet away from the apartment. Officer Salinas later put it into the back of his car to take it in for evidence. He said that there were no signs of forced entry, and there was nothing that was disturbed or thrown around in the apartment. This seems to suggest that this wasn't some kind of a robbery that Mo somehow just got wrapped up in. In other words, whoever shot her wasn't there for any stuff in the apartment. Next, the prosecution showed some body cam footage of the crime scene, which apparently shows Cash performing CPR on Mo's body. Cash is then on all fours, and Officer Salinas takes over for her. In the body cam footage, you can apparently see and hear him note the shell casings on the floor to the other police officers. And on the stand, he said that in his opinion, she was already gone at this point, but he continued doing compressions for as long as possible. In the body cam footage, then you can see the EMS arriving, and they check her wounds, note the exit wound, and eventually call it after taking over for compressions. Okay, the next witness is Chris Lester, Austin County Travis EMS. He was the EMS guy that arrived on scene. He apparently goes into a graphic description of Mo's body as he found it, and I'll save you the details. But apparently it was bad enough that Mo's dad had his head in his hands and appeared to be plugging his ears. I cannot imagine being in Mo's parents' situation right now. Anyway, cross-examination of Lester was basically focused on how many people were there to investigate the scene. Police officers, firefighters, and EMS, and whether they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. Such as, for example, wearing gloves. Lester said that he was wearing gloves, but he couldn't recall if anyone else was. So maybe that's going to be fodder for the defense moving forward. Maybe we're going to hear some officers not wearing gloves. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, next was Nathan Taylor, another police officer on patrol that night. He didn't go inside the apartment, but instead secured the perimeter, and they showed more body cam footage through him. The footage at one point shows Officer Taylor moving a bike bag from the bottom of the stairs leading up to the apartment and putting it over in the grass. He testified that he did this so that no one would trip on it. On cross-examination, the defense indicated this is violating the sanctity of the scene and that he's not supposed to be moving evidence around. But his response to that was, yeah, maintaining sanctity of the scene is important. Yes, very important. However, it's not as important as trying to save a life, and at this point, that's what they were still trying to do. Safety above preservation of evidence. Makes sense. On redirect, he also made it clear that he was wearing gloves when he moved the bag, so it's not like his DNA was getting on it. Anyway, next witness. This was Officer Padilla, another APD officer who arrived on the scene that night. Basically, this was to introduce more body cam footage so that the jury really could see absolutely everything in the crime scene. The body cam footage also included questioning of Cash, asking about information about Mo and about her relationship with Colin. On cross-examination, it had come up that Mo had been involved in some domestic disturbances, but I couldn't see any more detail about that. So I don't know exactly what those domestic disturbances were, if she just happened to be there when someone else was having a domestic disturbance. I'm not sure. But anyway, the other thing that the defense attorney was trying to do on cross-examination was to minimize Padilla's credibility as an investigator, since he hadn't been trained as a homicide detective in Austin. However, on redirect, the jury learned that Officer Padilla had previously had plenty of experience in Puerto Rico on their major crimes division. So the point about Officer Padilla being inexperienced is ineffective in my opinion. Next witness was another officer, Officer Lopez, and this is another police officer who arrived on scene that night. This came with more body cam footage, which shows Lopez was the one who found the bicycle when she was setting up the perimeter. After that, they heard from Sergeant Rolando Ramirez, a homicide detective. They did a walkthrough of the apartment, and Mo's body had already been removed at that point. He said there were no signs of struggle in the apartment. A small cabinet apparently was open and a candy bar was on the ground, but otherwise there were no signs of theft. He also noted that the placement of the bicycle just did not make sense to him. It's a valuable bike, and if someone had taken it in order to steal it, why would they just leave it behind in the bushes? He also is the one who found the surveillance footage of Kaitlin's Jeep by asking a neighbor if he could review everything that they had. This was, I think, the next morning after the shooting happened. And so that's how they have the ring footage that caught Kaitlin's Jeep rolling down the driveway at 8:37 p.m. He said that when he was initially reviewing the footage, when he saw the SUV, the thing that initially triggered suspicion for him was the fact that it had a bike rack on the back. And so based on everything that he gathered in the early hours and days of the investigation, the theory that he had was that whoever shot Mo personally knew her and shot her intentionally, possibly even out of anger. And so far at this point, at the end of day one, I'd say that this is the prosecution's case to lose. I always like to keep an open mind in all of these cases. And also, I like to be surprised. If I make a conclusion early on, I like to encounter evidence that changes my mind. But this just feels so overwhelmingly like it's going to end up in the state's favor. But that's what I've got for day 1. Stay tuned for a day 2 recap. And before you go, if you could, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with those YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more stuff like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. See you in the next one.